The sound of shattering glass rang sharp against the wooden floor, echoing through the brightly lit dining room. Claire stood still, her hand clenched tightly, her eyes cold as ice. "You think it's time for me to move out, don't you, Ethan?" Her voice was soft but cutting. Ethan didn't look at his mother, only nodded slightly, his eyes avoiding hers like a child caught in a lie. The dinner meant to honor his late grandfather's birthday had turned into a courtroom without a verdict. Margaret Rowan sat motionless, her napkin slipping from her trembling fingers. The ocean breeze blew through the window, lifting the white curtain, and she felt as though she herself were being swept away from the only home she had ever considered a refuge of love. The meal continued in the quiet clinking of silverware against porcelain. Ethan finally spoke, his tone detached. "Mom, we just think it'd be better if you lived on your own. More space, more privacy." "Privacy." She let out a hoarse, broken laugh. "You call throwing your mother out of her house privacy?" Claire shrugged, taking a delicate sip of her wine. "Please don't take it the wrong way. We just think you need to rest. Your old seaside house is still there, isn't it?" Margaret looked straight at her, then turned to her son. In the warm light, Ethan's face carried the calm confidence of a successful man, but his eyes were hollow, stripped of warmth. "Let me ask you one thing, Ethan. If I had nothing left, would you still want me around?" He didn't answer. The question hung in the air, cold and heavy, like the sound of waves crashing against the cliffs outside. Then she stood up, her hands trembling, but her voice steady. "I'll go. But remember that some things once lost, you can never buy back." She left that house in the middle of the night. The wind whipped through her silver hair, her frail shoulders shaking, but her eyes burned bright. At 70, Margaret was no stranger to loneliness, but she had never felt betrayal cut this deep. On the late-night bus, she watched the rows of streetlights fade behind her, her chest tightening. She had once been a literature teacher at Silverport High School, the kind who told her students that family was the root of everything. But now, her own roots had severed themselves. That night, when she returned to her small house by the sea, she found the mailbox stuffed with unopened bills. Inside the room was silent except for the steady ticking of the wall clock. She made herself a cup of tea, her hands still trembling. The light reflected off a family photo on the shelf, Ethan at 10, smiling brightly in her arms. She touched the glass gently and whispered, "Where did you go, my son?" The phone rang. On the other end was a calm, measured male voice. "Mrs. Rowan. This is Daniel Hartman, attorney from Vancouver. I'm calling to inform you of something important." His tone was polite, deliberate, but each word pierced the stillness of her home. "Your cousin, Mr. Leonard Rowan, passed away last month. In his will, he left you his entire estate valued at $6 million. She froze. $6 million, she thought she'd misheard. In all her years of teaching, she had never had more than $20,000 in her account. She set the teacup down, steam blurring her vision. "Are you certain, completely certain, ma'am? I'll send the official documents first thing tomorrow." When the call ended, the house suddenly felt unfamiliar. $6 million, a number that could change a life. But inside her, there was only emptiness. Joy didn't come, only a cold question. If Ethan knew, what would he do? She pictured her son's face hearing the news. Would he be happy that his mother was secure, or pleased that the money could help the family? The ache in her chest deepened sharper than any illness. The next morning, Margaret opened her window. Fog covered the sea, the wind carrying the scent of salt. She looked at the envelope Daniel had sent, sealed carefully, with a dark red stamp. Inside was the document confirming her inheritance. $6 million in the hands of the woman her own son had called a burden. A thought struck her, making her heartbeat quicken. What if she lied and said she had lost everything? Would Ethan open his arms to her or turn away just like he had that night? She sat down at her desk and took out a piece of paper. The first line she wrote was shaky but firm. Ethan, there's something I need to tell you. The pen slid across the page, leaving a smudge of ink. Tears fell, mixing with old pain and new curiosity. She would test him, not to punish, but to see how much love remained in a world that had forgotten how to care. In the small seaside room, the 70-year-old woman sat alone, her eyes burning bright through the mist. Outside, the waves crashed hard against the rocks, breaking into thousands of glittering droplets, just like her heart scattered, but never completely gone. A new chapter had begun, quiet yet unyielding. Morning in Silverport began with a thin veil of mist covering the sea. The cries of seagulls echoed in the distance, blending with the rhythmic crash of waves against the cliffs. In her small wooden house, Margaret Rowan sat by the window, a cup of cold tea in her hands. She hadn't slept all night. $6 million, that number floated in her mind like a strange dream, unreal and distant. From a woman cast out by her own son, she now held in her hands a fortune that could change the course of their entire family. But instead of joy, she felt only emptiness. The more wealth she had, the more afraid she became afraid that the only thing her son saw in her now was an opportunity. Pale light slipped through the curtains, resting on the familiar things that had accompanied her throughout life. The old wooden table where she once did homework with Ethan, the faded wedding photo, and the last birthday card her son had sent 3 years ago, with just 2 lines. "Happy birthday, Mom. I'm too busy to come home." Margaret held the card, her heart aching. Love, when forgotten, hurts even more than betrayal. The doorbell rang. She startled slightly. Outside stood a woman in her 40s, strong and graceful, her hair tied up neatly. "I'm sorry to bother you. I just moved into the house next door last week. I'm Amelia Cruz." Her voice was warm and friendly. "I noticed your lights were on all night, so I came to check on you." Margaret smiled softly and invited her in. They sat together in the small kitchen, sharing a pot of warm tea. Amelia told her she was a retired nurse who'd moved to Silverport to escape the noise of the city. "I took care of my mother for 3 years before she passed away last year. I've been living alone ever since, just like you now." Margaret listened, her eyes slowly softening. It had been so long since someone had sat and listened to her. They talked about the sea, about their old jobs, and then gradually the conversation drifted to family. When Margaret mentioned Ethan, her voice grew low. He used to be such a gentle boy. But life changes people so fast. Now I'm not even sure what I am in his eyes anymore. Amelia was silent for a while, then said, "Some children only learn the value of their parents when they lose them or when they've lost something themselves. But you still have the chance to see it clearly." Those words struck Margaret like a narrow beam of light cutting through her mind. "See it clearly," she repeated inwardly. Perhaps the time had come. When Amelia left, Margaret stood at the window watching her neighbor's figure fade into the mist. Inside her, a plan had begun to form. That afternoon, she sat beside the old telephone, carefully dialing each number. The ringing dragged on each tone, stretching her heartbeat tighter. Finally, Ethan's voice came through, deep and tired. "Mom, what's wrong?" Margaret took a deep breath, steadying her voice. "Ethan, I'm in trouble. I lost all my savings. The bank says they're taking the house. I have nowhere to go." There was silence on the line, then Ethan answered faster than she expected. "Oh God, Mom, don't worry. You can stay here for a while. Just come tomorrow, okay?" Margaret closed her eyes. His reply drifted through her like a breeze, yet it chilled her deeply. Too easy, too smooth. His wife Claire had once sneered that their house was too cramped, so why now was she suddenly welcome? "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Of course, Mom. But don't bring too much stuff. The house is small. I've cleared out the living room for you." The living room, she repeated softly as if tasting the word. After hanging up, she sat still for a long time, the receiver still in her hand. A heavy sigh escaped her lips, weighted with the years pressing against her chest. Something felt wrong. A mother's intuition whispered that behind his sudden warmth lay a shadow she could not yet see, but she had to try. When night fell, she opened the old chest and took out 2 small suitcases. Inside were a few clothes, a journal, and the silver bracelet her late husband had given her. The moonlight streamed through the window, illuminating her wrinkled face, still strong and determined. She wrote in her journal, "Tomorrow I will find out what I still have, love or illusion." The next morning, Margaret woke early. The sea breathed cold mist against the porch, and seagulls circled in the distance. She called a taxi to the bus station and sat quietly staring out the window. The familiar street slipped away, one small house, one old sign at a time. Inside, her fear and curiosity intertwined like deep currents beneath the waves. She held tightly to a photo of Ethan as a boy. That smile, those eyes, she wondered if any part of that child still remained. Across town, Ethan was tidying up the living room. Claire stood nearby, arms crossed, her voice cold as steel. "You really plan to let her stay here?" Ethan sighed. "Just for a while. She needs help. I can't abandon her." "A while," she scoffed. "And what will you say when she finds out this house is about to be sold?" Ethan froze. "Claire, I just need a few days to figure things out. Don't make this harder." She shook her head. "You're too soft. Fine, let's see how long she lasts." Outside, the sky darkened. Rain began to fall, drumming softly against the windows. Meanwhile, on the crowded bus, Margaret watched raindrops trail down the glass. She told herself that if today was the first day of truth, she would face it with open eyes, no fear, no blind hope. She only wanted to know whether love, when tested, still kept its true shape. The bus stopped on the outskirts of Portland just as the sun rose above the trees. The morning air carried the damp scent of grass and gasoline, brushing against Margaret Rowan's face and waking her completely. She pulled her suitcase down her palms, slick with sweat. Before her stood Ethan's house, beige walls, red tile roof, a white wooden fence. She'd been here a few times before, but never had it felt this silent. No people, no barking dogs, just a white sign planted in the yard with bold red letters, "For sale." Margaret froze. The wind blew a few silver strands of hair across her lined face. She read the sign once, twice, as if her mind refused to believe it. The house the one Ethan had said she could come to that very morning was up for sale. Her hand slipped and the suitcase hit the ground with a heavy thud. The air thickened around her. An elderly woman stepped out of the house across the street, a basket of newspapers in her arm. She looked surprised, then gave Margaret a sympathetic smile. "Are you looking for someone? I'm Ethan Rowan's mother," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "He lives here, or rather he used to." The woman nodded slowly, her eyes soft with pity. "Oh, you're Ethan's mother. I'm Mrs. Finch. I live right across the street. They moved out last night. Late. A truck came, they loaded everything and were gone within a few hours. Moved out." Margaret repeated, barely a whisper. Not a word, not even a phone call. "I asked if something was wrong, but his wife just said they had urgent business and needed to leave town for a while. They looked tense. I think they might be having financial problems." Mrs. Finch paused, her gaze full of concern. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Rowan. Are you all right?" Margaret nodded, though her throat felt tight. She turned away, taking a few steps toward the empty house. The doors were shut, curtains drawn. She pressed the doorbell, no answer. Knocked, no sound. Inside, there was nothing but the hollow echo of silence. A strong gust of wind blew past, knocking the for sale sign against the fence with a dull thud. Margaret stood there, tears spilling down her face, without her even noticing. In that moment, she realized the test was over before it had even begun. Ethan had made his choice, and that choice was to run away. She sat on the front steps, her trembling hands pulling the suitcase close, hugging it tightly as if it were all she had left. Soft footsteps sounded behind her. "Mrs. Rowan!" It was Mrs. Finch's voice. "If you need a place to rest, I have a spare room. My husband passed away. I live alone, and it gets lonely sometimes." Margaret looked up and tried to smile. "Thank you. I'll be fine. I just need some time." Mrs. Finch nodded and left a small card before walking away. When the neighbor disappeared down the street, Margaret looked around. The block was quiet, the parked cars along the road all unfamiliar. It felt as if the world had erased every trace of her son overnight. She remained there until the sun climbed higher, then finally stood and called a taxi, her voice hoarse from exhaustion. On the way back to Silverport, she stared out the window, watching the scenery blur past each house, fading like a memory. Inside her, the pain hardened into a slow, burning anger. Ethan hadn't just abandoned her. He had lied, and worse, he had made her believe there was still a fragile thread of love left between them. When she arrived home, Margaret dropped her suitcase to the floor and sank into a chair. The late afternoon light slanted through the window, painting her face in pale gold. She no longer cried. Tears were a luxury she no longer wished to spend. Instead, she opened a drawer and took out the paper from lawyer Daniel, the confirmation of the $6 million inheritance waiting for her signature. $6 million and a broken heart. "All right," she murmured, her voice calm and cold. "If they ran from me when they thought I was penniless, let's see what they do when they learn I hold the fortune." That night, Margaret wrote a letter to Ethan. No blame, no pleading, just a few short lines. "My son, you've taught me a lesson. Don't worry, I learn fast." She folded it neatly without an address, leaving it there like a promise to herself. In the small seaside house, the sound of waves drifted through the window. For the first time in years, the quiet no longer felt like loneliness, but the beginning of something new. A faint smile touched her lips. Her eyes gleamed with a hard, steady light mixed with silent sorrow. The game had begun, but this time, the rules belonged to her. The next afternoon, light rain fell over the road leading to downtown Silverport. Margaret, wearing her old coat and holding an umbrella, stepped into the office of attorney Daniel Hartman. The air inside was warm and quiet, filled with the scent of oak and a trace of coffee. Daniel, a tall man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and thin glasses, stood as soon as he saw her. "Mrs. Rowan, it's a pleasure to meet you. Please have a seat." His voice was calm and steady, just warm enough to ease the trembling in her shoulders. Margaret set her canvas bag down and nodded. "I still can't believe this, Mr. Hartman. My cousin Leonard, we barely saw each other after I turned 17. Daniel smiled. He had no other relatives. In his will, he wrote that you were the only family member who ever sent him Christmas cards every year. To him, that small act of kindness was worth more than blood. Margaret fell silent, her eyes reflecting an emotion she couldn't quite name. She had lived a humble life, always helping others without expecting anything in return. And yet the reason she inherited a fortune was something as simple as an old card. Daniel slid a thick folder toward her. "This is the confirmation of asset transfer. The total amount is $6 million, including shares in Rowan & Associates Transport Company and several secondary investments. All legal procedures are complete. All that's left is your signature." The pen trembled slightly in her hand. $6 million, a sum large enough to change everything. But instead of feeling powerful, she felt a deep, hollow ache. Money can never buy back trust, can it, Mr. Hartman? The lawyer looked up, meeting the faded but unwavering strength in her eyes. "No, but it can give you control again. I've seen many people like you dismissed, underestimated, and then suddenly holding power they never expected. The question is, what do you want to do with it?" Margaret turned to the window. The rain streamed down the glass in long trails like memories flowing backward. "I don't know," she said softly, "only that I need to see people's hearts clearly, even if it hurts." Daniel nodded without another word. He simply placed a business card in front of her. "If you ever need investment advice or decide to start a charitable foundation, I'll help you." When she left the office, the rain had stopped. The Silverport sky had opened a faint break of light through the gray clouds. Margaret stood on the steps, breathing in the scent of the sea breeze. In her coat pocket, the $100,000 advance check felt like an invisible key, a key to a kind of freedom she had never known. But she wasn't ready to use it. Not yet. That evening, she stopped by Amelia's house. The little cottage glowed warmly, its door already open as if waiting for her. "You look different from yesterday," Amelia said, pouring 2 bowls of hot soup. "Good news." Margaret gave a faint smile. "If you received a gift but couldn't tell whether to be happy or afraid, would you call that good news or bad?" Amelia smiled kindly. "Depends on what the person holding the gift decides to do with it. If you ask me, maybe it's a chance to reclaim what was taken from you." Margaret said nothing. She told Amelia everything about Ethan from the phone call that said, "Mom, come stay with us," to the "for sale" sign in front of his house. Amelia fell silent, setting her spoon down. "I've seen that before," she said slowly. "My son, Julio, left me when I was 45. He said he didn't want to live with a weak mother. For a long time, I thought I'd die from the shame of it." Margaret looked at her, her eyes softening. "And how did you survive by learning that love doesn't mean letting someone walk all over your dignity?" Amelia replied, her tone calm but firm. "If you really want to know who your son is, don't ask him. Let life force him to show you." That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She sat in the living room, the lamplight spilling across the stained walls. She opened an old wooden box, took out a bundle of family photos, and studied each face. Ethan in his first year of college, smiling brightly. Claire on their wedding day, lips curved, but eyes cold. Margaret brushed her fingers across the image, then laid it face down on the table. A plan was taking shape in her mind, clear in every detail. She would make Ethan believe his mother had truly fallen on hard times. She would see whether any trace of humanity still lived in the son she once admired. The next morning, Margaret wrote a letter to Ethan. The words were so sincere that even she felt her throat tighten as she wrote, "My dear son, I know you're busy. I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm really in trouble. The bank has sent foreclosure papers, and I have nowhere to stay. Could I stay with you for a few days?" She folded the letter, sealed it in an envelope, and sent it by express mail. Then she waited. 2 days passed. No reply. On the 3rd day, the phone rang. Ethan. "Mom, I just got your letter. Of course you can come. We'll get the room ready. Don't worry about a thing." His voice was sweet, a little too quick. Every word sounded rehearsed, and it stung. "Thank you, son," she said quietly. "I'll be there tomorrow morning." When the call ended, Margaret sat perfectly still, her lips pressed together. Inside her, half of her wanted to believe him, the other half braced for the worst. She turned to the mirror across the room. The woman looking back at her was no longer fragile. She was older, yes, but her eyes were different now, deeper, sharper, colder. She whispered to her reflection, "All right, Ethan, your game begins here. But this time, your mother has one of her own." That morning, the sky over Portland hung heavy and gray, as though a thick curtain of clouds had settled over the city. Margaret Rowan sat on the bus, clutching her suitcase tightly, her heart torn between hope and dread. Through the window, she watched people walking briskly, each with somewhere to go, while she herself was heading to a place where she wasn't sure she'd be welcome. In her pocket, the letter from Ethan, hastily written with the words, "Don't worry, Mom, everything's ready," pressed painfully against her chest. Too ready, too smooth, she thought, just like his voice that day, warm but hollow. The bus stopped in Old Harbor, the quiet neighborhood where Ethan had rented a temporary apartment. The street was still the gray houses fading into the mist. Margaret stepped down, her legs trembling slightly. The door of apartment number 24 was shut, the curtains drawn. She pressed the doorbell once, twice, 3 times. No answer. She knocked, and the sound echoed sharply against the wood. Then Claire's voice came from inside, cold and sharp. "Who is it?" "It's me, Margaret," she said softly. Silence. After a few seconds, the door opened just a crack. Claire peered out, her face blank, not a trace of a smile. "You're early." Early, Margaret kept her voice gentle. "My son told me to come this morning." Claire shrugged. "He's busy. The apartment's small and we haven't finished setting things up yet." "That's all right, I can wait," Margaret replied. Claire opened the door a little wider, reluctantly. "If you insist on coming in, then come in." The apartment was dim and cramped, the faint smell of fresh paint still in the air. Margaret noticed only 2 suitcases and a few half-packed boxes. It looked as if they hadn't lived there long. Ethan emerged from the back room, his hair, messy shirt wrinkled. "Mom," he said awkwardly. "Sorry about the mess." Margaret looked around and smiled faintly. "I've lived in smaller dorm rooms than this. Don't worry." Claire poured her a glass of water and set it down on the table, not gently, but not quite harshly either. "We only have 1 spare room. You can stay there for now, but it's small, so I hope you understand." "Thank you," Margaret said softly, her eyes kind but weary. "I'm grateful you're taking me in." Claire smiled thinly, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, we're always happy to help." But when Ethan turned away, Margaret caught Claire's gaze. There was no warmth in it, only irritation carefully disguised as politeness. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. The walls were thin, and through them came the muffled sound of an argument in the living room, every word sharp and painful. "How long is she staying?" Claire's voice was harsh. "I don't know," Ethan said quietly. "She has nowhere else to go." "Just a few days." "A few days," Claire scoffed. "She'll cling for months, you'll see. We won't last a week. Claire, don't talk like that. She can hear you." "Good," Claire replied coldly. "At least she'll know she's not welcome." Margaret gripped the blanket, her heart pounding. She turned to face the ceiling, the words cutting through her chest like a blade. In the darkness, tears slipped silently down her cheeks. The next morning, she woke early. Claire was already in the kitchen making coffee. The smell filled the room, warm but not inviting. "Did you sleep well?" Claire asked, her tone polite but distant. "Quite well, thank you," Margaret replied, forcing a smile. "I can make breakfast for everyone. That's not necessary," Claire said quickly. "Ethan eats light, and I have to leave for work soon. At least let me set the table." "Really, it's fine." Claire interrupted, her tone tightening. "We're used to taking care of ourselves." The door opened, and Ethan entered, looking rushed. "Mom, I have a meeting today, so I'll be home late. If you need anything, just ask Claire." Margaret nodded. "Don't worry, I'll be fine." When they left, the apartment fell silent again. She sat at the table staring at the empty chairs, bitterness rising inside her. She felt less like family and more like an uninvited guest. Around noon, a knock startled her. It was a short woman in a wool coat holding a grocery bag. "Hello, I'm Denise. I live next door. I saw you just moved in. Need any help?" Margaret smiled gratefully. "Thank you. I'm only here temporarily. My son's renting this place." Denise tilted her head. "Oh, the young couple. They moved in 2 nights ago, late at night. Funny thing, though, I heard the wife on the phone talking about moving out soon." Margaret froze. Moving out. She said it clearly. "We have to leave before she arrives." I didn't know who she meant, but Denise hesitated. "Maybe I'm wrong, but be careful. She didn't sound like she wanted you here." Margaret thanked her and closed the door, her pulse racing. The last piece of the puzzle fell into place. Claire had known she was coming and had planned to leave before she arrived. And Ethan, he had stayed silent, letting it happen. Later that afternoon, when Ethan returned, Margaret called him over. "Ethan, be honest with me. Did you really intend for me to stay here?" He looked surprised. "Of course. Why would you ask that? Then why did your wife tell the neighbor you're moving out?" Ethan froze, then looked away. She must have misunderstood. "No, Ethan." Her voice trembled, but her tone was firm. "Don't lie to me anymore. I'm too tired to believe kind words that mean nothing." Ethan said nothing, his face pale in the fading light. Margaret turned away, walked to her room, and closed the door quietly behind her. The small room grew darker, the faint glow from the window soft against her face. The pain inside her was no longer anger, but something quieter, something breaking apart. Yet beneath that sorrow, something else was awakening, cold, steady, and stronger than ever before. She whispered to herself, "All right, my son. I won't cry anymore. Now you'll see who your mother truly is." That night, a heavy storm swept through Silverport. Thunder rolled in the distance, lightning flashed across the sky, and for a brief moment the small room where Margaret lay lit up before sinking back into darkness. She lay still, eyes wide open, her mind spinning with the words she'd heard earlier. "We have to leave before she gets here." That single sentence echoed in her head, sharp as a needle piercing through her veins. Near midnight, she sat up and opened her door. A sliver of light glowed from the living room. Ethan was sitting on the couch, phone in hand, his voice low and weary. "I don't know, Claire. My mother can't leave right now. Just a few days, please. Don't make me throw her out in the middle of the night." There was silence on the other end. Then he added, almost pleading, "I'll find a way, all right, I promise." Standing in the dark hallway, Margaret clenched her fists until her knuckles turned white. That was the moment she knew for certain Ethan was not on her side. The next morning, the sky cleared, but inside, Margaret, the clouds still lingered. When she stepped out of her room, the apartment was empty. On the refrigerator was a note in Claire's handwriting. "We had to leave for work. Don't wait for us." Beneath it, a key sat loosely on the table. The message was clear: "Stay, but don't interfere." Margaret sat down, the sunlight slanting through the window, illuminating the deep lines on her face. Then, as calm as the sea before a storm, a thought crystallized in her mind. If they were so afraid of having to carry her, then she would make them lose her completely, along with everything they might have gained from her. Around noon, she called her lawyer, Daniel Hartman. "Mr. Hartman, I'd like to ask something. Can the inheritance money be moved into a private trust, one that no one, not even family, can touch?" "Absolutely," Daniel replied. "I can help you set up a confidential fund or trust. No one will know unless you choose to tell them." "Then do it." she said softly but firmly, "and make sure my son's name never appears on a single document." That afternoon, Margaret packed her few belongings and decided to leave before they had the chance to do it first. When Ethan and Claire returned, she was already gone. Only a note remained on the table, the handwriting steady and composed. "Don't worry about me. I found my place." She returned to Silverport that night. The sea roared fiercely, waves crashing into white foam as if releasing years of anger. Margaret opened the door to her old home, the damp scent of wood rushing to greet her like an old, loyal friend. Everything was as it had been. The rocking chair by the window, the crooked family photo, the teacup still marked with an old stain. She turned on the lamp and sat down, wrapping her arms around herself. In the soft yellow light, her face no longer looked fragile. She reached for her notebook and wrote in careful handwriting, August 24th today. "I learned that sometimes love doesn't die. It simply changes shape into something colder, truer. I used to believe, but now I know some people only stay as long as they need you." That night, she didn't cry. She simply gazed out the window at the sea, her lips pressed together in quiet resolve. In her mind, a new plan was forming, not another test, but an answer. She would rebuild something out of the ruins, a life that no longer revolved around anyone's pity. The next morning, as the first sunlight streamed through the window, Margaret poured herself a cup of tea and smiled faintly. She whispered, "If they think I'm a burden, I'll become something they can never reach freedom." Outside, the sea brightened the sun, spreading golden light across the surface like liquid gold. And inside the small seaside home, where the 70-year-old woman sat in silence, a new fire was being born, quiet, steady, and impossible to extinguish. The next morning, the first light of day filtered through a silver mist, illuminating the old wooden house by the sea. Margaret Rowan had been awake since dawn. She wore a beige wool cardigan, brewed a cup of coffee, and sat by the window, watching the ocean stir beneath the soft wind. Her silver hair fluttered gently, but her face was calm, almost serene. The night before she had made her decision, there would be no more tears for people who no longer deserved them. She opened her notebook and wrote a few lines, August 25th. "I am no longer a mother waiting, but a woman beginning again." The handwriting was slightly slanted but steady, and within each stroke of ink lay the quiet strength of transformation. At 8 o'clock, a knock sounded at the door. It was Amelia, her new neighbor, holding a basket of bread and her usual kind smile. "I was worried about you," she said. "The wind was strong last night. I thought you might be scared." Margaret smiled softly. "I'm not afraid of the wind, only of people's hearts." Amelia sat across from her. "I can tell you've made a decision. You look different, lighter." Margaret nodded slowly. "I'm going back to see my lawyer. I want to do something meaningful with that money, not out of revenge, but to live with purpose." That afternoon, she stepped once again into Daniel Hartman's office. He greeted her with respect. "Mrs. Rowan, I've prepared the draft for the charity foundation you requested. It will be called the Silverport Women Fund, focused on helping elderly women with no family or home." Margaret looked at the documents, emotion welling inside her. $6 million, something that once frightened her, was now a tool to help those who had walked the same lonely path. "I want to start right away," she said firmly. Daniel smiled. "I'll handle everything. But are you sure you don't want to leave any part of it to your family?" She turned toward the window where sunlight shimmered on the distant waves. "Family isn't just blood, Mr. Hartman. Sometimes it's the strangers who choose to listen." Later that day, Margaret stopped by the town market to buy flowers. While she was selecting them, she overheard two women talking behind her. "Did you hear the Rowans in Portland sold their house?" They left overnight. I heard it was because of debt. She froze for a moment, her heart tightening. Ethan, so it was true. They had fallen. A part of her, a mother's instinct, still hurt for him, but that feeling quickly gave way to reason. She whispered, everyone has to learn their own lesson. When she returned home, Amelia was watering flowers by the porch. "Looks like you've heard something today," she said gently. Margaret looked up, her eyes steady but bright. Bad news, but it brought peace. Maybe this is the fairest outcome they've lost, the one thing they valued most, my trust. Amelia nodded. "Forgiving doesn't mean going back, you know that, right?" Margaret smiled. "I know. Forgiveness means taking back control over how much power someone has over your emotions." That evening, Margaret wrote again in her journal, "Ethan, if you ever read this, know that I still love you, but love is no longer a chain. It's a light one that lets me see who you really are and also shows me the path ahead." The sea breeze drifted through the window, carrying the scent of salt and jasmine. She closed her notebook, poured herself another cup of tea, and looked up at the sky as it turned gold. The sunset spread across Silverport, bathing the sea in amber light. In that glow, her face no longer held the emptiness of someone abandoned, but the calm assurance of a woman who had reclaimed herself. For the first time in many years, Margaret felt free. Not because of wealth, but because she no longer depended on anyone to feel loved. She told herself quietly, "Tomorrow I'll truly begin again. A life where trust is placed only where it belongs." Outside, the waves continued their steady rhythm like the heartbeat of someone newly reborn. The next morning, Silverport glistened under the soft light that followed the night's rain. The sun rose gently from the horizon, casting a pale golden glow over the low seaside houses. Margaret Rowan woke early, dressed in a simple brown coat, and tied her silver hair neatly. Today was the day she would return to attorney Daniel Hartman's office to officially sign the documents establishing the Silverport Women Fund. When she arrived, Daniel was already waiting with a neat stack of papers. "Congratulations, Mrs. Rowan," he said respectfully. "Today your foundation is officially approved for operation." Margaret smiled and signed the final page. Each stroke of her pen felt like cutting away another invisible chain that had bound her for years. Daniel handed her a copy of the documents. "May I ask, why did you decide to give most of your wealth away instead of keeping it for yourself?" Margaret looked toward the glass wall behind him, where the reflection of the distant blue sea shimmered faintly. "Because when my son thought I had nothing, he left me. Now that I truly have everything I've realized, there's one thing no one can take from me: my dignity." Daniel was silent for a moment, then nodded slowly. "That's a rare and beautiful answer." Later that afternoon, Margaret stopped by a small cafe along the coast. The breeze lifted the white curtains and carried in the scent of the sea. She chose a table by the window and ordered a cup of hot lemon tea. At the next table, two young women were laughing and chatting about work and love. Their bright voices made her think of her younger self, so trusting, so full of hope, unaware of how cold life could be. She smiled softly. Perhaps faith never truly disappears. It simply changes shape, becoming quieter, steadier. Just then her phone buzzed. A message appeared on the screen. "Ethan, Mom, I need to see you. Please give me a chance." Margaret stared at the words for a long time. Her heartbeat slowed, then steadied. She didn't reply, not out of resentment, but because she wasn't ready to hear excuses. She folded the phone shut, set it on the table, and turned her gaze back to the waves rolling beyond the shore. That evening, when she returned home, Amelia was waiting on the porch steps. "I heard you've started your foundation," she said. Margaret smiled faintly. "Yes, I'm going to help women who have no one left. They deserve to spend the rest of their lives in peace. Amelia nodded with admiration. You're doing what most people only dream of. Not really, Margaret replied quietly. I'm just repaying a debt the years I let others decide what I was worth. The two women sat side by side on the porch, listening to the rhythmic crash of waves. Silence lingered between them, but it wasn't heavy. After a while, Amelia spoke softly. I used to think losing a child meant losing everything. But maybe losing misplaced trust is how we begin again. Margaret looked at her eyes warm with understanding. You're right. When the heart breaks, it finally has room to hold something new. That night, Margaret sat at her writing desk by the window. The small lamp cast a soft golden glow over the page as she wrote, her hand trembling slightly, but her words steady. Today I chose compassion over anger. I no longer need anyone to prove my worth. I only need peace. She set down her pen and smiled faintly. Outside, the moon had risen, its light reflecting across the ocean like thousands of shattered mirrors forming a silver ribbon on the water. In the quiet home of the 70-year-old woman, there was calm, but also life. Somewhere far away, Ethan was trying to call his mother again, but Margaret didn't know, and she didn't need to. That night, she slept soundly free of broken dreams. And when dawn arrived, a new chapter of her life quietly began. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting a golden glow on the cream-colored walls of the old seaside house. The scent of coffee mixed with the salty sea air filled the small kitchen. Margaret Rowan stood silently watching the sunrise, feeling an unfamiliar sense of peace. It had been years since she felt this way, no longer weighed down by anyone, no longer waiting for a phone call, no longer clinging to fragile hope. There was only the sound of the waves and herself. She poured her coffee and opened her worn notebook. On the first page, she wrote August 28th. I am beginning again. No one can hurt me anymore unless I allow them to. The words flowed slowly but firmly, a quiet promise to herself. After breakfast, she went out and stopped by the flower shop at the corner to buy some lavender and wild daisies. The shopkeeper, a young woman named Lydia, recognized her. Mrs. Rowan, I heard you're the founder of the Silverport Women Fund. That's truly admirable. Margaret smiled kindly. Thank you, but I'm only doing what someone has to do. There are far more lonely, older women out there than we realize. Lydia wrapped the bouquet and asked curiously, I hope you don't mind me asking, but what made you start this project? Margaret thought for a moment before replying, heartbreak. Pain shows us that we're still alive. On her way back, the sea breeze brushed against her face, carrying a hint of salt and cool moisture. She paused by her favorite cafe, about to step inside, when her phone buzzed. A message appeared on the screen from Ethan's old number. Mom, I know I was wrong. Please meet me just 10 minutes. I need to talk to you in person. She stared at the screen, feeling her chest tighten. Every word seemed to press against an old wound that hadn't fully healed. She took a deep breath, then turned off the phone without replying. Not out of anger, but because she wasn't ready to return to the place where her heart had once been torn apart. That evening, she told Amelia as they sat together on the porch sipping tea. My son sent a message. He wants to meet. Amelia was quiet for a moment before asking, do you want to see him? Margaret looked into the distance, her voice calm. Maybe I do, but not now. I need to know what I'll say when I face him, not from pain, but from clarity. Amelia nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. You're stronger than you think. Forgiving someone doesn't mean forgetting, it means knowing when to stop. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She opened an old box of photographs, Ethan at 10 years old, smiling brightly in his school uniform, her hand resting proudly on his shoulder. Love is the only thing that makes us willingly foolish, she thought to herself. But maybe it's also the one thing that helps us survive everything. The next morning, Daniel Hartman called. "Mrs. Rowan, I have good news. The Silverport Women Fund just received its first financial approval. An organization in Salem wants to partner with us." Margaret smiled. "Thank you, Daniel. You've helped me more than a lawyer ever could." "Not at all," he replied. "You helped yourself. I just stood beside you." They talked for a while longer. Before hanging up, Daniel asked, "Do you think you'll tell your son about this?" Margaret hesitated. "I don't know yet. But when he does find out, I want him to understand that what I'm doing isn't revenge. It's proof that I can live well without him." That afternoon, she went down to the shore, bringing her notebook and pen. The sea was calm, small waves washing gently onto the sand. She wrote on a new page, "Ethan, if one day you read this, I want you to know there are wounds I do not blame you for, I just don't wish to touch again. I don't need you to apologize. I only need you to learn how to love without calculation." The wind picked up blowing strands of her silver hair across her face. At 70, her features were no longer soft, but her eyes glowed with the strength of someone who had finally found herself. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, she stood watching the ocean turn brilliant orange. In that sunset glow, her figure looked small but unyielding, her back straight, her shoulders trembling slightly yet full of resolve. What remained in her heart was no longer resentment, but a new kind of faith that sometimes losing someone is how we find our true life. Later that night, Margaret sat by the window, the moonlight illuminating her tired but peaceful face. She brewed tea and turned on her old radio, letting a soft classical melody fill the room. She smiled as she took the first sip, the warmth spreading through her chest. Outside, the waves kept their steady rhythm like the breathing of the world itself. Before turning off the light, she wrote one final line in her journal. "Today I didn't cry when I spoke of my son. Maybe that's what healing looks like." And as the moonlight faded over the sea, the woman who had once been cast aside slowly closed her eyes. For the first time in years, she slept without dreaming of the past. There was only peace, light, and quiet like the sea breeze brushing across the shore. The next morning, the Silverport sea shimmered like a sheet of glass. Margaret Rowan opened the door to let the breeze and the salty mist drifting through the house cool and clean. She brewed tea and opened the planning folder Daniel had sent the day before. Inside were the detailed outlines for the charity's operations rental assistance programs, handicraft workshops, and healthcare support for elderly women. She read each line carefully, jotting down notes, feeling lighter with every page. $6 million no longer felt like a number that isolated her. It had become a chance to rewrite the meaning of her life. Near noon, Amelia stopped by with a basket of fresh vegetables and her familiar gentle smile. "I heard from Daniel that your foundation already received its first application," she said. "How does it feel to be the head of an organization?" Margaret let out a small laugh. "I'm no leader, just someone who's been abandoned and knows what loneliness feels like." Amelia poured tea and replied softly, "Then remember this. Sometimes those who have lost everything are the ones who give the most." They sat together for a long while. The wind blew gently, the rhythmic crash of waves outside, forming a melody they both knew by heart. Margaret felt calm until her phone rang. A number she didn't recognize appeared on the screen, Ethan Rowan. Her hand trembled slightly. After a brief pause, she answered. Her son's voice came through hoarse, low, threaded with despair. "Mom, it's me. Please don't hang up. I know I don't deserve it, but please listen to me once." Margaret closed her eyes, steadying her voice. "Go ahead, Ethan." "Mom Claire left me," he said, his voice breaking. She took all our savings, everything. I lost my job. I have no one else." "What is it you want from me, Ethan?" she asked quietly but firmly. "Mom, I know I hurt you. Please just give me a chance. I need you not for money, but because you're the only family I have left." She was silent. Those words, had she heard them months ago, might have shattered her. But now they fell like small stones into a calm lake. She wasn't angry, only tired. "Ethan," she said evenly, "you only reach for me when you have no one else. You don't need your mother. You need a safety net. And those are two very different things." "Mom, please don't say that," he pleaded. "I mean it this time. Mean it," she said softly, a faint, sad smile on her lips. "The night I needed shelter, you locked the door and walked away. Now I open my heart, but not so someone can step in, only so I can step out. Do you understand?" On the other end, there was only his ragged breathing. "Mom, you can't just leave me like this." "No, Ethan," she said gently. "I'm not leaving anyone. I'm just done holding on." She ended the call and slowly set the phone down on the table. Amelia, who had been silent all this time, reached over and held her hand. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. Margaret nodded. "I am." It's strange, not satisfaction, but relief, as if I finally set down a burden I've carried for 40 years. That afternoon, she went down to the beach, carrying a few old papers letters Ethan had written as a child, and some faded photographs. Sitting on the sand, she unfolded one of the letters, reading the childish handwriting. "Mom, when I grow up, I'll buy you a big house." She laughed softly, the sound light and fleeting before it disappeared into the wind. Gathering them all together, she lit a small fire and watched as the paper turned to glowing ash, the gray dust drifting out to sea. "You were once my dream," she whispered, "but from now on, I'll live for my own." When the fire died out, she stood. The wind caught her skirt and lifted it slightly. Above her, streaks of orange painted the clouds, blazing as bright as her spirit felt. Now no more darkness, only soft, steady light. That evening, Daniel called again to ask if she would attend the public launch of the foundation the following week. "There will be press television. Your story could inspire many people," he said. Margaret thought for a moment before replying. "If my story helps someone believe they can rise again, even after being hurt by their own family, then I'll share it. But not as a victim, as someone who chose to forgive." Later that night, she sat by the window, the lamplight soft against her calm, yet resolute face. She opened her journal and wrote, "Today I didn't get angry when my son called. I only felt compassion for him and for the woman I used to be. I've spent my life living for others. Now it's time to live for myself." Outside, the sea darkened, the waves beating steadily like a heartbeat. In the quiet little house, an old woman was rewriting her story, not with resentment, but with grace. And for the first time, she was no longer afraid of tomorrow. The grand opening of the Silverport Women Fund came sooner than Margaret expected. That morning, the sky was a clear, brilliant blue, and the soft white clouds drifted slowly as if smiling down on the woman the world had once turned its back on. Margaret Rowan stepped out of her house, wearing a pale gray dress and a sea blue shawl. Sunlight caught her silver hair, making it shimmer like polished silver. The Silverport Community Center was busier than anyone had imagined. Outside, lavender bouquets and white banners lined the walkway. The words "Silverport Women Fund for the Women." "The World Forgot" stood out boldly under the light. As Margaret entered, the audience rose in applause. Daniel Hartman came forward, shaking her hand with both of his. "You've done something extraordinary, Margaret," he said warmly. "From pain, you've created something beautiful." She smiled gently. Sometimes the most beautiful things are born from what's been broken. Mr. Hartman. Inside the hall, the cameras from the local news station were already rolling. A young female reporter approached her, her voice filled with admiration. "Mrs. Rowan, what inspired you at 70 to begin a new journey like this?" Margaret paused for a moment, then answered calmly, her tone warm and steady. "Because I know what it feels like to be forgotten. I was once a mother, abandoned by her own child, a woman who believed her worth existed only in the eyes of others. But when they turned away, I discovered someone who had never left me myself." The room erupted in applause. Daniel raised his hand to quiet the crowd before announcing the foundation's first grant, $100,000 for a women's shelter in Salem. The hall filled with cheers and tears. Margaret looked around at the faces, some smiling, some crying softly. A young woman stepped forward, embraced her, and said through sobs, "Thank you. You've given us hope that it's never too late to start again." Margaret hugged her gently and whispered, "Hope is never too late, dear. Sometimes we just have to lose everything to realize we had it all along." The ceremony ended in a wave of warmth and light. As people began to leave, Daniel remained beside her. "You've given so much, Margaret," he said quietly. "But I get the feeling there's still something in your heart that hasn't settled." She hesitated for a moment, then replied softly, "Yes, my son. He doesn't know about any of this yet. Maybe one day he will, but when that day comes, I want him to see a different mother, strong, free, and no longer in need of anyone's pity." Later that afternoon, Margaret walked along the Silverport shoreline. The waves lapped gently at the sand, the golden sunlight rippling over the water. Inside her, she felt light, as if she had finally let go of every last trace of sorrow. The sea breeze brushed through her hair, carrying the mingled scents of lavender and salt, the fragrance of both past and present blending as one. She sat on a wooden bench, facing the horizon. In the distance, a child ran across the sand chasing a red kite. Margaret smiled, remembering Ethan as a boy running along this same beach, laughing freely beneath the sun. That laughter remained in her memory, though the pain surrounding it had long faded. She thought quietly, "Maybe one day my son will come back, but whether he does or not, I'll be all right." Above her, the red kite soared high, its thin white string trailing behind it. It felt like a reminder that some connections between mother and child still remain, not to bind, but to remind that love once existed. And for her, that was enough. That afternoon, Silverport was quieter than usual. The pale blue sky stretched wide, streaked with long white clouds, like ribbons of silk. From the window of her wooden seaside home, Margaret Rowan gazed out at the ocean where sunlight shimmered across the water like 1,000 tiny mirrors. She had just returned from the grand opening of the Silverport Women Fund, an event that had filled the entire town with excitement. Yet inside her, beneath the joy, there lingered a quiet emptiness. On the table sat a neat stack of thank you letters and media interview requests, but Margaret's eyes stopped on one envelope worn unmarked with no return address. The handwriting was instantly familiar, painfully so. It was Ethan's. She opened it slowly, as if afraid to touch something fragile. Inside was a short, shaky letter. "Mom, I know I don't deserve to call you that, but I have to write because silence is driving me insane. I'm living in a small rented room on the outskirts of Salem doing warehouse work. I have nothing left. Claire is gone. I used to blame you for everything, but now I realize it was me. I'm the one who lost it all. I just want you to know that I'm sorry. Not because of your money, but because I finally understand what you went through. I hope one day you can forgive me. I don't expect to see you again. I just hope you're at peace. At the bottom, his name was signed in a trembling hand, as if written late at night. Margaret held the letter, her eyes blurring. Her tears no longer came in storms. As they once had, they were warm and quiet now. Perhaps because this time they did not come from pain, but from something deeper, a sorrow tinged with compassion. She read the letter again, folded it carefully, and placed it beside her journal. That evening, Amelia came by. Seeing Margaret sitting silently with a cup of untouched tea, she sensed something had changed. "You heard from your son?" she asked softly. Margaret nodded and handed her the letter. After reading it, Amelia sat still. Maybe he really is sorry. Perhaps Margaret said quietly, but regret doesn't bring back what's already gone. I just worry that if I see him, I might soften. Amelia gave a sad smile. Softening isn't weakness, Margaret. Sometimes it's the sign of someone strong enough to stop seeking revenge. Those words stayed with Margaret long into the night. Later, she opened her journal, the pen moving slowly but steadily across the page. Forgiveness isn't about erasing memory, it's about choosing not to let it control you. I've spent half my life living for Ethan, and the other half I'll live for those who need me more. The next morning, she received a call from Daniel Hartman. "Mrs. Rowan, I have good news. Your foundation has received its first 2 applications for support from 2 elderly women in Salem. They heard about you on last night's broadcast." Margaret smiled. "Can you arrange for me to meet them? I want to hand the support to them personally." "Of course," Daniel replied warmly. "I'll come with you." Both women said they had lost everything, but after hearing your story, they believe they can start again. That afternoon, Margaret and Daniel drove to Salem. The coastal road stretched long beside crashing waves, white foam bursting against the cliffs. When they arrived at a small house, an elderly woman with silver hair and a frail but lively frame stepped out. "Mrs. Rowan," she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "I'm Nora. I saw you on TV. I thought if you could rise after everything, maybe I could too." Margaret took her hand tightly, feeling as if she were holding the hand of her younger self. "We all can, Nora. Sometimes life pushes us down only to remind us we still have legs to stand on." After delivering the grants and listening to their stories, Margaret sat quietly in the car. Daniel glanced at her. "Do you ever regret not leaving anything for your son?" She looked out toward the horizon where the sea reflected the fading glow of the sun. "No, I didn't punish him with money. I punished him with silence, the kind that echoes louder than any words." By the time they returned to Silverport, night had fallen. The warm light from her small house spilled gently through the windows. Margaret brewed a pot of tea and turned on the radio. A soft, aged female voice sang an old tune, "There's a light that never goes out." Margaret closed her eyes and whispered, "Yes, that light is me." She took Ethan's letter and placed it inside a drawer, the same one where she kept her most important memories. Not to forget, not to remember, but to let it rest there between the past and forgiveness. Later that night, she stood on the porch, gazing at the star-filled sky. The sea breeze brushed against her face, salty and cool, but she no longer felt lonely. She whispered almost to herself, "I've forgiven him, not because he deserves it, but because I deserve peace." And as she stepped back inside and closed the door, Margaret knew that this time the door did not close out of fear or hurt, but because she had finally found true peace within herself. The next morning, Silverport was veiled in a soft mist, with pale sunlight filtering through the rows of pine trees lining the coastal road. Margaret Rowan woke earlier than usual. She no longer felt that hollow ache when she opened her eyes, but instead the calm relief of someone who had finally set down a burden carried for far too long. She opened her cabinet and took out a small wooden box, Old and worn, the place where she kept her most important memories, a few photographs, an aged birth certificate, and now Ethan's letter. Setting the box on the table, she lifted the lid and looked at each item as if revisiting fragments of a life once lived. Her fingers brushed over the letter, and she whispered softly, "Thank you, my son, for finally telling the truth." Her voice was low, steady, no longer trembling. After breakfast, she walked to the seafood market where the smell of fresh fish mingled with the chatter of vendors. People greeted her with a newfound respect. "Mrs. Rowan, we saw you on TV last night. Your story was so inspiring," a middle-aged man called out with a warm smile. Margaret smiled back gently and nodded. "Thank you. I just told the truth that anyone can begin again no matter their age." On her way home, she met Lydia, the young florist. Lydia handed her a bouquet of lavender. "I wanted to thank you. My mother watched your story and cried the whole night. She said because of you, she wants to reconcile with her sister after 10 years apart." Margaret accepted the flowers, her eyes glistening. "Thank you, Lydia. If my story helped even one person love again, that's enough for me." By afternoon, Daniel Hartman stopped by carrying new documents for the foundation. "Mrs. Rowan," he said, "your fund has been featured everywhere in the media. A university in Portland has invited you to speak with their sociology students. They want to hear how someone turned pain into compassion." Margaret chuckled softly. "I'm just an old woman living by the sea, Daniel." "What could I possibly teach college students?" Daniel smiled kindly. "It's exactly because you think that way that they need to hear from you." After he left, Margaret sat on the porch, watching the sunset stretch across the water. She opened her journal and wrote slowly, each word deliberate. "I have forgiven not in words, but in actions. I no longer resent Ethan because I know everyone must learn their own lessons. If one day he understands, he will find his way back." The wind swept across the porch, lifting a few strands of her silver hair. She closed the journal and smiled. In that moment, an unfamiliar feeling washed over her, not quite happiness, but a pure, quiet serenity. As if after years of storms, the sea had finally stilled. That evening, Amelia arrived with a warm apple pie. They sat under the soft yellow light, sharing dessert and conversation. "Do you think Ethan will come back someday?" Amelia asked. Margaret looked out the window where moonlight glimmered on the waves. "I don't know," she said softly. "But if he does, I'll listen not to judge but to understand what he's learned from loss." Amelia smiled. "You sound like my mother. She used to say, 'Real love doesn't need to be returned, only not distorted.'" Margaret nodded and replied quietly, "That's true. And I think I've finally found that kind of love within myself." That night, Margaret stepped out onto the porch, cradling the lavender bouquet Lydia had given her. She inhaled deeply, letting the sweet scent fill her chest. The distant sound of waves rolled like a lullaby. She closed her eyes and let the wind carry away everything old and heavy that still lingered in her heart. In that wind, she could almost hear the sea whispering, "You've found your way home." And for the first time in many years, Margaret smiled genuinely peacefully, not for anyone else, but for herself. Because she knew she had finally found the woman she once lost, the forgotten one, who had now become a light for those still lost in the dark. On a clear September morning, Silverport glowed under the bright sunlight. Cool sea breezes drifted through the air, brushing against Margaret Rowan's silver hair as she stood before her newly built cottage near the harbor. The house was modest but filled with light and warmth, purchased with a small portion of her remaining inheritance. Along the porch, she had planted a row of lavender, the same flower Lydia once gave her, whose scent had become the symbol of her new beginning. Inside the living room displayed a large painting, the first she had ever completed since joining the community art class. It depicted the ocean after a storm, sunlight breaking through waves of deep blue. She had titled it, "The Morning After." Every time she looked at it, peace settled over her heart. Today was special, the first gathering of the beneficiaries of the Silverport Women Fund. Daniel Hartman had arranged for the event to take place in a small seaside hall. Margaret had prepared her speech, though her heart still fluttered like that of a young girl about to stand before an audience for the first time. When she arrived, more than 20 women were already gathered, some young, some old, all with eyes filled with hope. Amelia and Lydia sat in the front row. Daniel approached her with a smile. "Everyone's waiting to hear you, Margaret, not just because of the foundation, but because they want to know how someone who lost everything can smile the way you do." Margaret nodded, took a deep breath, and stepped up to the podium. The morning light streamed through the window, illuminating her face. She began slowly, her voice calm, yet firm. "I once thought my life had ended at 70 when my son left me, and I no longer had anything or anyone to hold on to. But sometimes when we believe we've hit the bottom, that's when the ground starts lifting us up. I didn't start this foundation out of pity, but because I know how terrifying it is to feel forgotten. I want everyone here to know that we still have value, no matter what anyone says, no matter our age or circumstances." The room was silent. Then, one by one, faces began to light up. An elderly woman stood, her voice trembling. "Mrs. Rowan, my daughter, threw me out because she said I was a burden. I thought I'd never be able to lift my head again. But hearing you speak, I don't feel so alone anymore." Margaret stepped down from the stage, took the woman's hands, and smiled. "We are never alone. Sometimes we just forget that we still have each other." The hall erupted in applause. Daniel watched from the back, his expression full of quiet admiration. He knew that the woman before him was not just the founder of a charity, she was living proof of resilience. The event ended in laughter, hugs, and warmth. As people began to leave, Amelia came to her and took her hand. "I'm proud of you. You turned your pain into something truly beautiful." Margaret replied softly, "All we need is one person to believe they can start over. Today, I believe that's true, not just for me, but for every woman here." That afternoon, Margaret returned home. The sea was calm, the wind gentle. She brewed a pot of tea, set it on the table, and opened the window to let the breeze in. The golden light of the setting sun reflected off her painting, blending the hues of blue and orange into a soft shimmer. She sat down and wrote in her journal, "Today I told my story without feeling pain. I realized that when we use our suffering to help others rise, it stops being a wound and becomes strength." As night fell, a gentle knock sounded at the door. It was the mailman handing her a thick envelope. The handwriting on it made her heart stop. It was the same familiar hand, but steadier, more deliberate. "Dear Mom, I'm working in Salem now. I've rented a small apartment and started over. I'm not asking for money, I just want you to know I'm trying. Every day I read about your foundation, and I wonder how you can still be so full of life after everything I've done. I want to learn that. If you're willing, I'd like to see you not to ask for forgiveness, but to say thank you. Ethan." Margaret read each line slowly, her hands trembling, her eyes misting over. There were no desperate pleas this time, no hollow remorse. This letter came from a man who had truly changed. She folded it carefully and placed it beside the steaming teacup on the table. She didn't respond right away. She needed time not to decide whether to forgive, but to let her heart be completely still before reopening the door that had long been closed. She whispered to herself, "My son, if you truly come back this time, I want to meet you not as someone broken, but as someone who has learned to love herself." Outside the window, the sunset poured gold over the sea. The waves rolled gently, their rhythm as calm as her heart, finally finding its peace. And in that tranquil silence, Margaret smiled the smile of a woman who knew that no matter how cruel the past had been, there would always come a day when the light returned. The next morning, Silverport glowed softly beneath a veil of mist. The cries of seagulls echoed over the harbor, mingling with the steady rhythm of the waves. Margaret Rowan opened the porch door and took a deep breath of the salty air. Today she felt different, light calm, as though everything inside her had finally found its place. She brewed a cup of tea and sat at the wooden table. On it lay Ethan's letter, resting neatly beside a bundle of dried lavender. She read it again, her aged eyes shimmering with a gentle light. Ethan's handwriting had changed. It no longer carried desperation or pleading, but sincerity, humility, and maturity. For the first time, she could feel that he was truly rebuilding his life, not for anyone else, but for himself. By noon, she went down to the beach. The sky was high, the water clear, the sunlight spreading gold across the waves. She walked slowly along the sand, her footprints deep enough that the wind couldn't erase them right away. In her hand, she held her son's letter. With each step, memories returned, little Ethan running along this same shore, holding up his blue kite, laughing with all the joy in the world. Her heart softened. Margaret stopped and looked toward the sky. "Ethan," she whispered, "if you've really changed, I don't need an apology. I just need you to live kindly, and that will be enough." She folded the letter, placed it inside a small glass bottle, and let it drift into the sea. The first wave carried it away, glimmering beneath the sunlight. That afternoon, she arrived at the community center, where the volunteer painting class was beginning. More than a dozen women, young and old, sat around a long table, chatting and laughing. Amelia walked over, resting a hand on Margaret's shoulder. "You're just in time," she said. "We were just talking about naming this class the morning after your painting." Margaret smiled. "That's a beautiful name because everyone deserves a morning after the storm." In class, she guided the women as they held their brushes, mixing colors, painting fragments of their own stories. The sounds of laughter, soft music, and brush strokes blended into something tender and alive. Watching them, Margaret saw pieces of her own past women who once believed all they had left was sorrow, now finding their own light. As evening approached and the class ended, Amelia asked, "Do you think you'll see your son again?" Margaret looked out toward the sea where the sun was beginning to set. "Perhaps someday," she said softly, "but I don't want to see him to fix what's broken. I want to share. I want him to see that his mother is still standing, still living, fully without bitterness or blame." Amelia smiled. "That's real strength." When night fell, Margaret returned home and opened the window to let the sea breeze flow in. On the table, the paintings her students had left to dry shimmered with color. She sat down and wrote the final page in her journal. "Today I learned that love isn't always returned, but it's always worth giving. Forgiveness doesn't make us weak, it makes us free. And freedom, that's the greatest gift I've found after everything." She closed the journal and looked out at the night sky. The sea glittered under the moonlight, the waves rolling softly like a song. She smiled and whispered, "Thank you for teaching me to love life again in my own way." The imagined camera slowly pulled back, leaving the image of an elderly woman sitting by a glowing window framed by moonlight and the sound of waves. The narrator's voice rose gently like the wind. If Margaret's story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to hear more stories about love, forgiveness, and the quiet strength of mothers. The final scene faded with the sound of the sea, soft, free, and full of peace.